What if I told you one car was so deceptive, so perfectly engineered to exploit every loophole, that NASCAR completely changed its rules because of it? Smokey Yunick's famous Chevel was no ordinary race car. It looked stock, but it wasn't. From a shrunken body to hidden tricks under the hood, this car was a masterpiece of rulebook manipulation. But how did Yunick's genius force NASCAR to rethink inspections forever? Let's unveil this mechanical mystery. Did Smokey Yunick really shrink a full-size Chevrolet Chevel? At first glance, the idea sounds too ridiculous to be true. How do you make a full-size race car smaller without anyone noticing? But with Smokey Yunick, nothing was impossible, especially when it came to finding the smallest gaps in the rulebook and squeezing every ounce of advantage out of them. Smokey wasn't just a mechanic or an engineer. He was a master manipulator of both machinery and regulations. His motto, "If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying," wasn't just a clever quip. It was the foundation of his entire racing philosophy. And it's what led him to create one of the most controversial cars in NASCAR's history. A car that forced the sport to rethink how it policed its own rules. To understand Smokey's 7/8 scale Chevel, we first need to step into the world of NASCAR inspections during the 1960s. Back then, all stock cars had to pass the same basic tests. The challenge was to prove that your car was, in fact, a stock vehicle, something you could buy at a dealership. But NASCAR's inspection process wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. They relied on tape measures, simple tools, and the naked eye to ensure each car fit the dimensions on the manufacturer's spec sheet. That was their fatal flaw, and Smokey knew it. He realized that as long as the changes he made to a car were too subtle to notice during a quick inspection, they weren't technically against the rules. Here's where the myth of the shrunken car comes in. Smokey didn't actually make a 7/8 scale replica of a Chevrolet Chevel. What he did was far more clever and infinitely harder to detect. By narrowing the body of the car by 1.5 inches, he created a slimmer profile, giving it less surface area to push through the air. Then he dropped the roofline by an additional 2 inches, making the car even lower and more aerodynamic. NASCAR inspectors, relying on tools that couldn't account for subtle changes like these, didn't catch a thing. The Chevel looked just close enough to stock to pass their primitive process, but out on the track, it behaved like a completely different machine. Smokey didn't stop there. He tucked the car's bumpers inward, reducing drag even further, and smoothed out the entire frontal area of the vehicle. These tweaks might sound minor on paper, but in motorsport, where tenths of a second decide races, they added up to a critical advantage. The car could slice through the air with far less resistance, making it faster while requiring less power to maintain high speeds. And all the while, Smokey hadn't technically broken a single rule. NASCAR might specify that a car had to be stock, but they didn't have precise enough definitions to catch these microscopic alterations. Smokey built his legacy in that gray area between the written rules and what wasn't written yet. The car's performance on the track earned it the nickname Gray Ghost. It was a fitting name, not only because of its silver paint and shadowy origins, but because it left competitors wondering how it could be so fast. Drivers like Curtis Turner knew they were driving something special. Turner once described it by saying the car felt like it was running downhill, a nod to how smooth and effortless it was compared to anything else on the track. In NASCAR terms, that's the highest compliment a car can get. Proof that everything under the hood, above the roofline, and in the aero package was perfectly tuned for domination. But Smokey's real brilliance wasn't just in what he changed, it was in how much he could change without getting caught. By making the alterations just subtle enough to pass visual inspection, he proved that rules weren't there to limit him. They were there to inspire him. NASCAR officials knew something wasn't right. The car didn't look exactly like any other Chevel on the grid, but they couldn't prove anything. Smokey had turned their own vague standards against them, exploiting every oversight and loophole with surgical precision. The fallout from Smokey's 7/8 scale car was massive. While NASCAR couldn't penalize him directly, after all, they didn't have the technology to disprove his claims, they knew they couldn't let things continue unchecked. Smokey had exposed just how vulnerable the inspection process was, and it forced the organization to evolve. In the years following his innovations, NASCAR began overhauling its entire rulebook. New tools, stricter measurements, and more detailed procedures became the norm. Smokey wasn't just a competitor, he was a catalyst for change. If Smokey Yunick's reputation as a rule bender was forged in the details you could see, the real genius of his work was in what you couldn't. His 1966 Chevrolet Chevel wasn't just tweaked on the surface for aerodynamics. Beneath the body panels was an engineering masterclass that targeted every overlooked area of the rulebook, ensuring the car was as fast and efficient as possible without crossing a single hardline rule set by NASCAR. What was hiding under the hood? The answer changed how the sport defined its limits. While Smokey's engineering pushed boundaries, his psychological tactics were just as cunning. NASCAR officials and his competitors never knew which of his innovations were real and which were simply there to distract them. He often planted decoy modifications, adjustments that looked suspicious but served no functional purpose, to draw attention away from his true handiwork. He'd keep officials scrutinizing a harmless component while they overlooked the subtle but critical alterations elsewhere. Rivals spent as much time worrying about what Smokey might have done as they did focusing on their own setups, a deliberate move that gave Smokey's team a head start before the cars even hit the track. Smokey manipulated not just machines, but minds. What Smokey achieved with these under-the-hood tricks was more than just theoretical. His work showed results, none more dramatic than at Daytona in 1967. Curtis Turner, behind the wheel of Smokey's Chevel, broke the 180-mile-per-hour barrier during qualifying, a feat no one else on the grid had accomplished at the time. It wasn't just a new benchmark for speed, it was a statement of dominance. Other teams were left scratching their heads, unable to figure out how Smokey was extracting so much performance from a car that passed inspection like any other. This was the culmination of his philosophy. A car that appeared ordinary enough to play by the rules, yet delivered extraordinary results on race day. NASCAR officials, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. Smokey's cars presented a problem they couldn't figure out how to solve. Every victory or near victory he secured reinforced their inability to police the loopholes he found. He wasn't outright breaking rules, and yet his cars consistently outperformed the competition. For NASCAR, this wasn't just about catching Smokey. It became a challenge to preserve a sense of fairness in the sport. Smokey, however, viewed the rulebook differently. To him, it was less a set of constraints and more a puzzle to be solved. His ability to consistently operate in the gray areas confounded inspectors and team owners alike. What Smokey did under the hood wasn't just about speed, it was about subtlety and deception, about understanding every written and unwritten law of racing better than anyone else. While other teams focused on brute power, Smokey approached the sport like a chess game, planning moves several steps ahead. Rivals could study his cars, but they couldn't copy what they didn't understand. This combination of mechanical genius and strategic misdirection elevated Smokey beyond just being a great mechanic. He was a visionary. Smokey's 1966 Chevel remains a symbol of what happens when creativity meets opportunity. It wasn't just fast because of one trick under the hood. It was the sum of countless tiny advantages, all working together to push the limits of what was possible under the rules. While NASCAR eventually caught up, Smokey's cars left a lasting legacy. The realization that the future of racing would belong to those bold enough to question how things had always been done. Smokey Yunick wasn't just a rule bender, he was a visionary who forced NASCAR to confront its own limitations. His 7/8 scale car and the tricks beneath its surface defined a moment when the sport realized it needed to evolve or risk falling behind innovation. As NASCAR inspector Hank Hester admitted, the full-body templates introduced in 1968 were designed specifically to trap that Chevel. That's the power of Smokey's legacy. He redefined the lines others were afraid to cross. Should innovation like his be celebrated or tightly regulated? Smokey's story proves progress often comes from daring to ask that very question.